Okay, so lecture 2, early observations. And so what we're going to get into on this one is just discuss a little bit of the things that humans have thought over the centuries. So obviously, procreation is certainly something that humans have sort of processed through and have thought about. If you think about the aspects of as humans went through sort of that Neolithic period where they started to bring in agriculture and religions and things like this, the concept of fertility, the concept of procreation was always a part of that. So this is not an attempt to go through all of those ideas. I'm going to focus primarily on just the embryology. And in this case, what we have is the first recorded embryologist, if you will. So the first guy that basically started to explore these ideas, and his ideas actually are recorded for us, would be Aristotle, which would have been about about 2,000 years ago, or 2,300 years ago. And he would, as the Greek philosophers would do, they would go out and look at the world around them and just try to come up with explanations for what it was they were seeing. So he actually did a lot of observations of life cycles of different kinds of animals and looked to see how the next generation was created. And I think one of his probably most important observations and contributions to the progress that we've made in the context of development would be his, for lack of a better word, in his experiment, where he basically took this clutch of eggs from a chicken and would gently crack open one of those eggs each day. So when a chicken lays an egg, it takes about 3 weeks for the incubation period to take place, and then the little chick will hatch. And so what he would do is he would start with these set of eggs that were laid, and then he would open them up on a specific day after that had taken place. So he was able to see essentially how far along the little chick was at each level, each time he opened one up. And based on that observation, he basically came up with this idea called epigenesis, which is essentially a description of a developmental process which is very progressive, very gradual, okay, where certain things give rise to the next thing in line, and the things that you and I have now would have been built off of things that came earlier. We'll discuss some of the ins and outs of that idea later in this chapter. This was important because one of the more popular, I think, ideas that would be considered a competitor to this idea of progressive development is one that's basically referred to as preformationism. I don't think they called it that, but it's what we call it now. And it was this idea that we knew that a part of the dad and a part of the mom would come together to create this next generation. And the idea was that, or I guess the arguments that oftentimes would take place would be revolving around which part was more important. Was it the mom's part that was more important? Was the dad's part that was more important? And then once we got microscopes that were powerful enough to see some things, so you remember Leeuwenhoek in the 1500s finally had microscopes that he could actually see little things in pond water and stuff, and it wasn't long before we could actually see eggs and sperm. And so we had context for what came from dad, what came from mom, and essentially what people were speculating at that time was that the sperm or the egg would actually have a little human inside of it, or a little organism. So human sperm would have a little human, or a human egg would have a little human, and basically what folks would be trying to figure out is, was the little human inside the sperm, or was the little human inside of the egg? So they basically divided themselves up into those two groups. You had the spermists, which were of the opinion that the little human was inside the sperm, and that little sperm was like a seed that you plant in the fertile soil of the egg, and then that little human just grows with all of its parts. Or the reverse would be the ovists, who thought that the egg had little human inside, and they would, all it needed was a spark of life from the sperm to basically trigger the growth, and it would grow into a baby. So you had these ideas on both sides, and these were very common, very popular. And this idea that Aristotle had of a very progressive growth process was not very well received even thousands of years after he proposed it. The other thing that kind of comes out of this is there were some other developments in science that were important. We'll talk about those in a second, or in the next section. But the idea of alchemy, these chemical constituents that are inside of us, and I'm not talking about the chemistry today as we think about it. I mean, back in those days, they talked about things like the humors, and well, you've probably seen, even today we have, it's more cultural than anything else, but you got the 4 elements of fire, water, and earth and wind, and each one of us is some mixture of those two, and can give rise to our emotions and the way in which we behave ourselves and so on. So with these ideas in mind, scientists would actually, well, you wouldn't really call them scientists, they were more like natural philosophers, would have these different ideas that they would use to try to do things, sometimes very unusual things. The pre-formationism really just prevailed as the main idea into about the 18th century, and then basically through the 1900s, it was, I wouldn't say debunked, but the scientific ideas that were discovered and put out during the 1900s were really quite important. So cell theory was one. We'll talk about it quite a bit throughout this course. And of course, Mendel in the 1860s is the one that first described those genetic factors. Of course, you can't minimize Darwin and his ideas about evolution and development that basically revolutionized some of the larger issues. And of course, there were lots of others that contributed to this idea as well. So we'll talk about those. Just wanted to leave you in this section with a couple of pictures from that time period. So this would be what's called a homunculus, a little tiny human inside of a sperm. So these would be pictures that would have illustrated some of the thoughts back then. So this is not a current illustration. I'm not sure, I remember when the date was, but if you type in homunculus into a Google search, you can find it. This would be hundreds of years old. And then here would be a picture of an alchemist doing an experiment trying to create human life by combinations of chemicals and other things in his laboratory. So there's a lot of things going on back then that wasn't necessarily based on scientific fact, but it matched some of the stuff we observed with our eyes. And again, it was not until we started to dig into the matter that creates life, cells and organisms, or cells and molecules and things like that, through the 1800s and to present day, that we really started to understand a little bit more about how life was put together. And interestingly enough, as more research was done, and that research was done, more and more we found out that Aristotle's ideas were spot on, and that sure enough we start as a zygote, and that embryo is going to build very progressively and gradually over time. And really kind of a neat thing that he was able to describe that thousands and thousands of years before the reasons for why that actually happens were discovered. Okay, so next time we'll actually talk about the importance of those concepts of cell theory and genetic inheritance to development, and how it helps to explain some of the observations that are made, or that have been made since then, and why some of the things that humans have believed for a long time really didn't make any sense when we finally figured out how humans are actually put together. Okay, so talk to you later.